You're just trying to hog all the money, aren't you? You're such a heartless daughter-in-law. I was worn out by my mother-in-law's constant requests for money. No matter how patiently and thoroughly I explained the situation, she wouldn't listen. She kept pestering me with calls whenever the amount wasn't to her liking, and I eventually caved in. My name is Katherine Johnson, a 31-year-old working housewife. I work alongside my husband, Bob, as we both have full-time jobs. We share household chores and live busy, yet fulfilling, lives. We met through a mutual friend and got along right away, which led to us dating. After being together for about 3 years, we found that our values and preferences aligned, making it easy to spend time together. While dating, we lived together and felt very comfortable, leading us to decide to marry, thinking we could build a happy home together. Despite the hopeful start, issues arose quite soon. 2 years into our marriage, things between Bob and me were smooth. The problem was with my mother-in-law. Thinking of starting a family, I wanted a child. However, due to uncertainties caused by my mother-in-law, I was hesitant. The first time I met her was when Bob and I visited her for the customary pre-marriage introduction. At that time, my father-in-law had just passed away, and she was living alone. According to Bob, she was a responsible mother. She was a stay-at-home mom, and Bob has fond memories of cooking and crafting with her. She praised when it was due and scolded when necessary, seeming to be a mother who truly cared for her child. I was nervous, knowing she was Bob's family. Moreover, Bob was an only child. And with the recent passing of his father, I thought she might be emotionally unstable. I was concerned that she might be harsh towards me. When we finally met, she did seem wary of me. Her face looked somewhat tense as she observed me. After I introduced myself, she scrutinized me and posed a slightly sharp question. "Oh, you seem rather plain. Do you have a stable job? You're not planning on just relying on my son and being lazy, are you?" It was ironic, coming from a housewife, and her tone felt hostile towards me. Still, I thought she might be concerned about her only son and felt lonely because of the marriage, so I decided not to let it bother me. "Mom, that's rude. Don't say things like that." However, Bob was angered by his mother's attitude, which escalated into a heated argument. "Please, calm down." I tried to mediate between them, taking into account my first meeting with her. But even after things cooled down, the visit ended on a somewhat sour note. I was worried, seeing my mother-in-law's demeanor. Still, I thought there was no need to force a close relationship, and since we weren't going to live together, I remained optimistic. Given the significant distance between our residences, I hoped we could at least occasionally meet and maintain a cordial relationship. Trusting that Bob would support me, I was relaxed about my mother-in-law at this point. However, after returning to our apartment where we lived together, Bob confessed that he had been sending money to his mother. "I should have told you sooner, but the thing is, she had never worked, being a housewife all her life. With the father-in-law around, this was never a problem. But after his passing, she began asking for financial help. She wasn't of retirement age yet, and even with the inheritance from her late husband, she could probably sustain her lifestyle for a few more years at most. Being fond of shopping, if she continued living as when her husband was alive, her savings wouldn't last a year. I didn't realize until now, but Mom isn't good with money. It seems Dad managed things before. When her husband was alive, he strictly managed their finances, and she used money responsibly under his guidance. But now, on her own, Bob felt uneasy about her spending habits. But considering they had been together for over 20 years, he initially thought he might be overly worried. Also, since Bob had already moved out and given her good health, despite her lack of work experience, he assumed she would manage somehow. But up until now, she had been leading a comfortable life, so I reckon my mother-in-law must find it tough to suddenly change her lifestyle, and it naturally worries me. Besides, she lost her husband, who she had been with for a long time, and the thought of her getting sick because of that really concerned me. I always thought parents would be fine, but my father had also warned me, and apparently, in the beginning, I was constantly chiming in and helping my mother-in-law adjust to her life. But my husband has work too, so he barely has time to attend to my mother-in-law. Traveling back and forth from our home to our hometown was quite the ordeal, since it's a considerable distance. Plus, my mother-in-law would pester us about sending more money, insisting that as long as she gets her allowance, everything's okay, leading us to eventually surrender and send her $1,500 a month.
Whoa! You're not sending her that much just because she's unwell, are you?
The amount he was sending was way more than I imagined, and I couldn't help but blurt out my surprise. I felt that just because she's family, that doesn't mean we should give her that much money. I don't want to put any burden on my mom, and I definitely don't want to inconvenience her, my husband reasoned. Apart from his regular job, my husband also earned from his blog, so we had some financial cushion. He started the blog during his college days when he had some free time, and by the time he graduated, he was already making as much as a typical office worker. Later on, he got a job at a company that allowed side hustles, so even now, while focusing on his main job, he still runs his blog, earning even more than he did in college, which has led to a comfortable savings and income situation. Sending $1,500 a month would still be manageable, even if our family grew in the future. I also understood my husband's concerns about his mother living alone, so I was okay with the allowance to her. With that settled, we tied the knot without any issues. But not long after we got married, I received a call on my smartphone from my mother-in-law. Curious about what she wanted, I answered, only to find out she was asking me to also contribute to her allowance.
Bob has been sending money, right? We can't spare any more than what we're currently giving.
I wondered why she was asking me as well when we were already sending $1,500, and even though she's my mother-in-law, I firmly declined.
You both work and have some financial flexibility, right? I'm really gonna be in a bind without a bit more money.
Receiving $1,500 a month and still saying it's not enough seemed unreasonable to me. She should have more than enough to live on with that, and I felt no obligation to send her any money. She sounded desperate and weak, but no matter how many times she asked, I politely declined. But she was relentless, and her tone gradually became harsher and more demanding.
You married into our family, so you have a duty to support me. You work, you have the means. Do you even care what happens to me? We're already sending $1,500, you know. It's not easy to make that kind of money. Asking for more is just not possible.
But the money I earned was for my husband and our future family. I'd only spend for the in-laws if it were a real emergency. From what my husband had told me, her current situation wasn't desperate at all. I tried my best to decline, but her screaming was making my head spin. After a long day at work, her barrage of verbal abuse was mentally exhausting. Wanting to end the call, my fatigue clouded my judgment, and I eventually agreed to contribute.
All right. I can do $200.
I thought I was being quite generous, but she complained.
What? Just that? You're so stingy. I don't get why Bob married someone like you.
I initially offered a smaller amount, but after her persistent complaints and whining, I eventually agreed to $500. And once she knew she was getting an extra $500, she hung up without even thanking me. Exhausted and flabbergasted, I let out a deep sigh. I discussed this matter with my husband that very day.
I'm really sorry about my mom. I can't believe she said that to Catherine.
Bob looked genuinely remorseful as he apologized. He mentioned that he'd tell his mother-in-law not to ask me for money anymore, but I insisted on providing it anyway.
It's okay. Besides, even if I refuse now, she'll probably keep pestering me for it. I did make a promise, after all.
My mother-in-law's demands over the phone were intense, and I honestly wanted to avoid any interaction with her as much as possible. If paying would bring some peace, then so be it. Fortunately, Bob and I had started a blog together while dating, and it was making enough money. Even if we added $500 to the allowance, it wouldn't affect our daily life. I'm sorry for causing trouble. Mom wasn't always like this. Bob apologized again with a weary look, even as I tried to brush it off. Just when I thought the money issue with my mother-in-law had ended, 6 months into our marriage, she contacted us again, wanting more money. She had developed problems with her legs and eyes and now had medical bills.
My legs aren't working right, and my eyes need treatment. I can't work, so I need more money from you.
At this point, we had become suspicious of her spending habits. But upon visiting her, it became clear she truly needed financial help. Still, she kept insisting on just getting the money from us, which made us uneasy. So, we were planning on taking care of the necessary procedures and transfers, but my mother-in-law strongly objected.
I can manage things myself if you just give me the money. So please, increase the amount you send.
She then requested a whopping $5,000, which we flatly refused.
There's no way your medical and living expenses are that high. If we take care of the necessities, our current contributions should suffice.
Even if we had a decent income, giving her $5,000 monthly would stretch us thin. Moreover, $300 a month should be more than enough for her medical needs. She was asking for way too much. From the beginning of our marriage, it was evident she had a penchant for money. Now, it felt like she had an obsession. It was almost maddening. We couldn't keep sending money her way without conditions. We tried to explain how difficult it was for us to earn that kind of money and how it would strain our lives. We even offered to guide her on managing her finances better. However, she barely listened and remained stubborn.
I want to have extra just in case. With my bad legs, I might need care, and I want to be prepared.
While she had a point, trusting her with such a large sum made us nervous.
If you ever need care, just tell us, and we'll help you out.
But she kept on about wanting more money.
You two won't be around immediately if something happens. If I have the money, I can manage on my own.
Negotiations at her place led nowhere. She was relentless, calling dozens of times a day, making most of our call logs from her. We couldn't even notice calls from work or friends anymore. After much persuasion, we eventually gave in and increased the allowance. Once we did, the calls stopped, and for the sake of peace, we deemed it a necessary sacrifice. Now, 2 years into our marriage, we are sending her $5,000 every month. While the monthly expense hurts, our income had increased since then. Just when we started considering having kids, tragedy struck. Bob was involved in a car accident while at work and had to be hospitalized. It was touch and go for a while, but with treatment, he stabilized. Thankfully, workers' compensation covered most of the hospital bills, but Bob was on medical leave, affecting our income. To keep sending money to his mother, we'd have to dip into our savings. Given Bob's condition, continuing the allowance for his mother seemed nearly impossible. We informed her about Bob's accident and explained that due to the medical bills and his absence from work, we couldn't provide the allowance.
Bob had an accident and is hospitalized. His injuries are pretty severe, and the treatments are expensive. So we won't be able to send money until he's discharged.
Considering we'd been sending her a generous amount, she should be able to manage for a few months. My mother-in-law always wants money, but I thought she would understand this time since my son had a serious accident. I was hoping that if I continued to send her money in the future, she would be considerate and ask for a modest amount so as not to trouble our son. However, my expectations were dashed.
What? No money? I can't live without it.
Instead of worrying about her injured grandson, my mother-in-law seemed more concerned about herself. This left me feeling quite frustrated. Anyone would normally be concerned about a grandson who's had a major accident. I've never trusted my mother-in-law's spending habits, but I believed she had love for her family. Now, I'm starting to doubt even that.
Bob really had a bad accident. He can't work, so there's no income. Plus, the hospital bills are high, so I can't send you $5,000 this time.
I tried to explain our situation to her as calmly as possible, but she got hysterical, demanding that I wire her the $5,000 immediately. No matter what I said, she wouldn't listen. Exhausted and dealing with Bob's accident and hospitalization, I decided to just send her the money to avoid further stress. But honestly, my mother-in-law seems to be getting worse every year. I never imagined she wouldn't be concerned about her own son. With the financial strain and concerns about my mother-in-law's behavior, I decided to discuss the matter with Bob once he stabilized. By then, Bob had been in the hospital for a month. He was still immobilized by his injuries, but he could talk to visitors. Even when I told my mother-in-law she could visit, she never did. However, my own parents, who live much farther away, came to visit Bob as soon as they heard. Seeing my parents visit while his own mother didn't made Bob quite sad. I'm really sorry about my mom. I can't believe she's like this. Bob remembered his mother being more considerate in the past, and he seemed deeply disappointed. With the stress from his injuries, he looked even more worn out.
Your mom seems to take the money for granted. If this continues, we're really gonna be in a bind.
Up until now, I had been patient since she's Bob's mother. But I've reached my limit and voiced my frustrations to Bob. It's not just about the money. Given how she's been acting, I wouldn't want her around our kids, if we ever have any. Seeing my distress, Bob made a determined face and made a suggestion.
My mom's behavior is really off. How about we test her? Test her? How?
I would normally decline such an idea, but given how much trouble we've had with my mother-in-law, I decided to go along with Bob's plan. Eventually, after 3 months, Bob was discharged from the hospital. We didn't tell my mother-in-law since she never visited during those 3 months. Bob was home but not fully recovered. As we were relaxing, a call came in from my mother-in-law. I figured she was probably calling about the money. Seeing her name on the caller ID, I felt a mix of frustration and dread. But this was the perfect time to execute our plan. Bob and I exchanged glances, nodded, and put the call on speaker. As expected, my mother-in-law's first words were about money.
Hey, where's this month's money? Send it now.
To execute our plan, I responded with a heavy tone. I can't send you money anymore. Your son has passed away.
What?
This was Bob's idea, the playing dead strategy. It's a last resort and quite distasteful, but my mother-in-law's behavior was too much to handle. So, I lied and told her Bob had died. We wanted to gauge her reaction to decide on future financial support. I've given up on expecting anything from my mother-in-law, but Bob still hoped she would care more about her son than the money. Sadly, reality proved otherwise. After a brief silence, she shockingly sounded pleased.
So, him passing away means that I'll get a piece of my son's inheritance, huh? When I heard he was hospitalized, I looked into the inheritance and found out that I have a share too. Catherine, I won't let you hog all the inheritance, you know.
I couldn't believe that upon hearing about our son's serious injury and hospitalization, the first thing she checked was the inheritance share. Even I was lost for words at my mother-in-law's reaction. It was beyond unexpected. My husband was so shocked by his mother's words, his face became expressionless, looking like a stone mask. We never imagined our mother-in-law would act this way. My husband and I were both taken aback.
You do realize that your child passed away, right? Aren't you sad?
I couldn't help but ask in a shaky voice, but all she seemed to care about was the money. I told her I'd never send her money again and that she won't get a cent from the inheritance, and hung up the phone.
I don't want anything to do with her anymore. I always thought she was my only mother, but I've decided to cut ties with her.
My husband murmured that quietly. He had been silently listening to the phone call and had made up his mind to cut ties with his mother. After that, we kept receiving persistent messages from her, but we ignored them all. The messages were always about money and never once mentioned my husband. When your child passes away, isn't the funeral the first thing you'd ask about? I was increasingly baffled by my mother-in-law's way of thinking. She's become completely obsessed with money. If she can't reach us, she'll probably come to our house. We quickly prepared for her possible visit. And sure enough, a few days later, as expected, my mother-in-law showed up. My husband hid in a room, and I confronted her. She never once visited him when he was alive, but as soon as money is involved, she comes running. I was dumbfounded. But I quickly switched gears, pretending to be the grieving wife, and dealt with her.
The moment I open the door, you're here shouting about the inheritance. And you've been ignoring all my calls. What kind of daughter-in-law are you?
She started yelling the moment the door was opened.
Aren't you sad that your son passed away? You never even visited him once.
I tried to reason with her as we moved to the living room, putting on a sad face.
Why should I visit? It's not like it would change anything. My livelihood is at stake here. Obviously, money for my future is more important than someone who's already gone.
But she was still fixated on the money.
Don't you care about your son?
When we first got married, she seemed to care about my husband. But in response to my question, she insisted that money was more important.
I've heard enough. It's clear that money is more important to you.
My husband came out of the room he was hiding in, and she screamed in surprise, thinking he was a ghost.
Why are you alive? Did you lie about being dead?
She was furious at the supposed lie, but we weren't going to take that from her.
To think you could say something like that after hearing your son was dead. I understand now how you think. We won't be sending you any more money, and we're cutting ties with you.
My husband had made up his mind. Despite my husband's declaration, she kept making excuses, but his mind was made up. We both looked at her coldly, and she started to get angry.
If you cut ties with me, my debt collectors will come after you. If you don't want that, then just give me the money. What? Debt?
My husband didn't seem to know either, and he pressed for an explanation. Turns out, my mother-in-law got addicted to slot machines and racked up debt, naming my husband as the cosigner without his knowledge. We knew she was reckless with money, but never expected she had debt. In a threatening tone, she said to us,
"Kids should listen to their parents. If you understand, then give me money."
But my husband's stance didn't change, responding calmly.
Even if we give you money, you ain't gonna use it to pay off the debt. Get out of here now.
With that, my husband kicked out the raging mother-in-law and locked the door. She caused a commotion outside for about 30 minutes, but then she seemed to give up and left. Afterward, we immediately moved to avoid any more interactions with her. Upon investigating the debt, we found out my husband never agreed to be a cosigner, so he had no obligation to repay. Turns out, right after we got married, when she first contacted me for financial support, she was already squandering money on slot machines. And when she had asked for more money citing medical bills, she already had debt. The extra financial support we gave her wasn't saved or used for repayments. It was spent on slot machines, and her debt just kept increasing. Realizing this, my husband was relieved. He decided to cut ties with her. With our financial support gone and only her debt remaining, she had no choice but to work. Having been a housewife all her life and with her problematic personality and mindset, it seems quite challenging for her to start working. She's now working hard to repay her debt, without even a minute to care about her appearance. Locals know about her recklessness with money and gossip about how she was disowned by her son because of it, making her life quite uncomfortable. After cutting ties, we were still in a position to get updates about her for a while, but after learning everything and completing our move, we blocked her number. Now, we won't have to send her money or be mentally stressed by her constant calls. Moving to a new environment and not having to deal with her brought a sense of relief and removed our anxieties about the future. Maybe it's because the stress from my mother-in-law disappeared, but I soon found out I was pregnant. Now, we look forward to our baby's birth and strive to ensure happiness for our family, living with a bright and hopeful heart.